Hi everyone, my name is James Lantz. I've been a technical designer at Klei for 2 years working on a procedural turn-based stealth game called Invisible Ink. Before I start, I want to give a shout out to Jason and Jamie. I don't think either of them are here right now, they're both super busy, but they're my co-designers in the project and I couldn't be up here without them. And also to the entire Invisible team, who's like 8 people, and it's just a murderer's row of geniuses basically, and then me sitting at the end. So the talk I'm going to give today is a deep dive post-mortem on the stealth systems in Invisible. I'm going to talk about how we approached it initially, what didn't work for a long time, the challenges we faced, and how we overcame those challenges. But before that, I want to confess to feeling a bit hypocritical. And here's why. I think that for the most part, the explicit takeaways of every post-mortem I hear are very rarely valuable for me. And I love post-mortems. I listen to them all the time. And they're often my favorite talks and they're my favorite articles, but every time I write up a post-mortem for an audience of developers, I always notice myself falling into the trap of trying to teach lessons. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. Which should be the most valuable part of any post-mortem, right? I mean, let's imagine a finished post-mortem. I've taken you through my entire process, from the game's initial idea, through finding the fun, through the iterative process of balance and feature design, through play testing, finally ending at marketing and production and hours of late-night polishing. And through this all, we've looked at where it went wrong and where it went right. And by combining those two things, we should be able to get a set of lessons that are super valuable for any game developer. In this situation, always do this because it worked out for me. In that situation, never do that. But if you look honestly at your own creative process, it's pretty rare that you actually use these lessons. And maybe there's occasionally a really, really good one that you've internalized and used intuitively as part of your design process. But most of the time, you have this chaotic development. And then you learn all these lessons and you talk about them. And then you go back to make another game and you have the exact same chaotic development process all over again, right? You don't take these golden sentences you wrote down and use them as a flowchart to pop out a great game every time. And the thing is that most of the time, each of our processes is really different from one another. And not only that, but every time you design a game, your process for designing that game ends up being really different from the previous games you've designed. So not only is it that I'm designing a new game, it's that I'm talking to a crowd of completely different people who are designing completely different games from me. And they're also designing completely different games for any game they've ever designed before. And if you ask me, I'd tell you that game design starts with mechanics. But that's not true for everyone, right? Sometimes it starts with art. Sometimes it starts with telling a story or a feeling you want to convey or an issue you want to explain to the world. And sometimes it's a real-world phenomenon that you want to encode into game language. And sometimes you as the designer are driving the game, but sometimes the players are driving it, or sometimes an artist is driving it. And if I really look honestly at my own process, I'm also lying to you that I always start with mechanics. I think of myself that way, but it's rarely true. And even when it is, it's not that simple. Because the process for designing and developing a game is so different depending on who you're working with and where you start and what you want to do with the game. So what does it really mean to deliver a useful post-mortem? That's what I've been asking myself. Because I do listen to these things all the time, and I also love them. And not only that, but I think I get a lot of use out of them. But the use I get out of them isn't the lessons they're explicitly teaching. It's something else. It's a developer's taste. It's a glimpse at the twisted mess of the creative process. It's a glimpse into someone's soul. And I know that sounds really cheesy, but I don't know any other way to describe it. To me, it really is one person's soul, one designer's soul, their creative energy talking to my soul. And the lessons I assimilate from that aren't really clear and obvious takeaways. So I'm going to try to give you guys a non-prescriptive design postmortem. And I hope this talk, in the end, can give you a bit of my soul and a bit of our soul at Klei. And I hope that what you get out of this talk is that the next time you're stuck on a really tough design problem and you think your game might need a little Klei or a little invisible ink or, God forbid, a little bit of me, you'll have the tools to invoke those tastes and this soul and our soul and answer the question, how would Klei solve this problem? Okay. I came into Invisible about 2 years ago, shortly after the prototyping phase of development. The original pitch for Invisible was syndicate but sneaky, basically. And when I came on, we were here at point A. And after about a half dozen months of slices and playtesting, we ended up here. And how we got here is too long a story to tell in this talk, but seeing as we're all in this industry together, I'm guessing I can just say game development, and you guys can fill in the anxious talks and tectonic design shifts that got us there. So it's the middle of the summer, we're in downtown Vancouver, it's beautiful, and we're at point B. And at this point, we've been tasked with building a turn-based procedural stealth game. And don't worry if you've never played Invisible Ink or you don't know what it is, because that puts you in the perfect mindset for what we were thinking about a year ago. Because we don't have any successful examples of turn-based procedural stealth to work with, lots of Invisible's development leaned heavily on some of the game's major influences. And these influences allowed us to basically explain the core of the game to anyone who asked outside of the development, and also to put the jumble of ideas in our heads into some sort of working order. And also, these are games we love very, very deeply, and invoking them helps us ground the game in these kind of gameplay patterns that we know are going to work on a basic level. That's what we thought. So as far as the overall structure of the game, our main influences were XCOM and FTL. The moment-to-moment is inspired most strongly by Spelunky and Mark of the Ninja, which I think is a really underrated game. And I think it's just crazy that not a lot of people have bought it here. I think you should go out to buy it. After the moment-to-moment stuff, the theme draws a lot from Syndicate and Neuromancer, and a lot of other cyberpunk staples, but, you know, those are the classics. There are a lot of systems in our game that are going to have to be unique. We knew this from the very beginning, because they're supporting this unique turn-based procedural stealth system. So when we come to a system that doesn't have to be unique, we're very, very happy to take our influences and basically just copy them, even if we know it's not innovative or clever. So we have a shop on every floor that sells random items. We have a final boss that represents a significant difficulty spike and requires strong items to defeat. We have different worlds with different enemy types. We have a cover system that represents itself with a shield icon. We've got 90-degree vision cones. You've seen all this before. But most of these things we knew were secondary to the system we knew was at the heart of Invisible Inc., which is turn-based procedural stealth. And for that, we turned to the classics of the stealth genre. Stuff like Splinter Cell, Metal Gear Solid, Mark of the Ninja, again, Hitman, Thief. Why do these games work, and what are the systems we can learn and take from them to make sure our game captures that core stealth gameplay for people who like those kind of things? And funnily enough, there was actually a lot less for us here than you might think. All these stealth games are fantastic games in their own right, but their systems and moment-to-moment fun rest really heavily on something we don't have, which is execution. We're a pure strategy game. We don't have reflexes. We don't have aiming. We don't have timing. For example, let's look at the moments that really bring something like Metal Gear Solid to life. The first time you enter a room, your goal is to map it out. Where are the guards? Where are the cameras? Where are the hiding spots? And the interesting part of this experience is that you're trying to process all of this and map it out with the time pressure of a real-time game bearing down on you. You're sneaking around, you're getting the lay of the land, you're hiding from guards, all while you try to wrap your head around the situation. And once you have the place mapped out, you have to devise a plan. Take out that guard first because he's isolated. Take the second guard out when the third one isn't looking. In almost every stealth game scenario, it's actually pretty easy to figure out a plan that will work. And not only that, but you can often think of 5 or 10 plans that will work. Just shooting every guard in the back of the head with a tranq gun is a totally fine and acceptable way to beat the entire game of Metal Gear Solid. Mark of the Ninja scenarios are a bit harder, but they're not that hard. You still have a lot of tools and leverage and core actions, and you can improvise most of the way through and come up with lots of different plans. The hard part of these games is taking that plan and executing quickly and cleanly, and improvising under a lot of pressure to get out of a situation. Again, most of this execution is based solely on time pressure. When is that third guard going to turn around? That's the question you're always asking yourself. Each of these situations works because of time pressure, but that's not the only problem we have in Invisible. Each situation also works because it was designed very deliberately by level designers to feel new and fresh. Each situation presents not only a new challenge, but also a new puzzle. Because stealth games don't have RPG-style combat mechanics, each enemy also has to be different on a fundamentally interesting level. The placement of enemies is much more important in this game, so it's much harder to make it procedural. So seen from a traditional stealth point of view, we have 2 challenges to overcome to make Invisible Inc. a core, good stealth game. Our first challenge stems from the fact that we're a turn-based game. The other set of challenges come from our attempt to make the game procedural. The problem with Invisible being turn-based is pretty simple. We just talked about it. Most of the moment-to-moment play in stealth games relies on execution. We don't have that. There's nothing fundamentally fun about clicking next to a guard. There's nothing inherently tense about looking over a static board and thinking, how do I get around this situation? Because you take your turn separately from the enemies, there's a complete lack of the play to counterplay improvisation that makes most stealth games so interesting. The problem with Invisible being procedural, on the other hand, is that we basically have no experience and nothing to guide us. So at the very early stages, we're sitting in a meeting and we're thinking about all the ways we can do procedural stealth. We're just imagining trying to take something like Mark of the Ninja and make it procedurally generated. Make those rooms, those levels, those puzzles procedural without them all being samey crap. And that's something we can't wrap our heads around at that time. And I leave the office that day thinking that there's a pretty significant chance that that kind of procedural design for stealth games is just impossible. To add to that, because we're a stealth game, we can't rely on the number tuning that other procedural games use So we can't make slightly tougher versions of enemies. It's not interesting. So we took our influences, we sat down in the meeting room, and we hashed out the kind of mechanics we wanted. Levels were procedurally generated at that point, but our first pass at gameplay leaned heavily on our XCOM influences, but added some stealth elements. That means that player units start with guns and tons of ammo, they have hit percentage chances, they take defensive cover to dodge shots, they have critical chances, all the XCOM tropes. Meanwhile, the game also let you sneak around, avoiding these guard vision cones and trying not to make too much noise. But as we sat down and played this thing, we realized it wasn't really a stealth game. It was XCOM with stealthy bits. Big chunky health points meant that rounds of combat took multiple turns to finish and drew every guard in the level to see what the noise is about, which meant that as soon as you shot, you were done playing stealth. It killed any pretense of stealth you might have before the fight. On the other hand, hit percentages made sneaky, precise combat basically impossible, because if you missed and blew your cover, your options were basically totally gone. You could only fight at that point. So your only options in this first prototype were to sneak through the entire level or to blast your way through it. At this point, we could have pushed forward and made a 2-in-1 playstyle-based game, meaning that we make a fun combat game on the one hand and a fun stealth game on the other hand, and we basically ask players, how do you want to play? And that's fine, and that has a lot of precedent in indie games and AAA games and all sorts of games do that kind of thing. But we didn't want to split our really limited time and resources making two totally different playstyles that are both kind of mediocre and then shove them both in the same world. We were really worried that would happen. So we started trying to figure out how instead to thread these systems together so they could support each other. And part of our problem was that we'd been looking to stealth games for inspiration, even though the challenges we were facing were totally different from those stealth games. The combat side of design, inspired by XCOM, was also making our characters feel like space marines, not like spies. And so our first prototype took a few months to make, and we kind of considered it a failure. We were so concerned about mechanics that we ended up with a jumble of mechanics, often just stolen from other games, often that didn't support each other at all, and none of them made sense in this new type of game. So we had to look elsewhere for something we could really rally a new vision around to glue all these pieces together. So instead of asking ourselves, what should this game be? What are the mechanics in this game? We started asking ourselves, how should this game feel to play? We realized that we could create a game that nailed the key moment-to-moment of being a spy. And so we started to employ a design strategy that had our desired gameplay moments telling us what kind of systems to make to build into those moments. So the next step was figuring out what these moments were. So we started combining spy movies, these kind of action-heavy spy movies like Jason Bourne and James Bond, with stealth gameplay tropes. And at the same time we were designing this, our artists were working from 50s and 60s spy movie posters. So we were starting to basically attack spy instead of soldier from all the angles we could. Our pivot towards taking inspiration from these different kind of media, these movies instead of games, was a huge step forward for our design. Instead of struggling to shoehorn these typical stealth genre concepts into this game, we were free to create whatever systems would best convey our tone and create these moments we wanted. So what makes you a spy? What are these moments? What makes you a spy instead of a space marine? A major emphasis is an element on fighting behind. Both literally and figuratively, you have to fight behind. So we had the literal part in the game. You could literally sneak up behind a dude and hit him in the head. But we didn't have the figurative part. So right now, you had a machine gun and they had a machine gun. You were fighting toe-to-toe, and that's how soldiers fight. But spies don't fight like that. A spy scene goes like this. If the enemy has a gun, she just has her hands. If the enemy just has his hands, she just has her hands cuffed to a chair. If she has a gun, then the enemy is incredibly tough, or he has a huge gun, or there are like 20 of him. And that's what being a movie spy is like. Fighting from behind also means using the environment and tricks to the best of your ability. When her tools aren't as good as her opponents, the movie spy improvises a tricky way out of the situation. For us, that means abstracting that out to resource management, to stand in for those tricks, and use some of the resources and energy and time pressures that movie spies feel. Different spy movies treat fighting differently, but in our game, we chose Bourne as our fighting touchstone. Because in Bourne, the fighting always supports the stealthier elements. It's quick and lethal, and fighting, running, and sneaking are all elements Bourne basically just uses to accomplish his singular goal, which is getting out. Now, we've taken this and we have some new direction for our stealth and combat elements. But one major problem remains, which is that in stealth games, planning is only interesting if the execution is difficult. And as a turn-based game, we don't have any execution at all. All we have is this kind of dull and easy planning. But in a heist movie, the planning is the interesting part. And at one point in time, Invisible Ink wasn't about spies. One of our past prototypes was strongly influenced by this kind of Ocean's 11 style heist movie. So partially inspired by these tropes and partially chiseled out through these kind of numerous design failures and long design talks, we arrived at the heart and soul of Invisible Ink's new mechanics. Very high level, very long-term planning, given unbelievable information. See, what makes planning in a heist movie interesting, what they had that we didn't, was an unbelievable amount and quality of information. And I don't mean unbelievable as in impressive, I mean unbelievable as in genuinely hard to believe. The bad guy always operates on this ridiculous schedule, which means they know where he'll be at any given time, they know what he'll be doing, what he'll be wearing, what he'll be thinking, what he'll be doing next. They know the guards, the layout of the building, the location of every bit of security. In heist movies, part one is the fight for that information, and part two is the analysis and exploitation of that information on a genuinely inhuman scale. And the problem in Invisible is that we only allowed players to see the kind of information they would really see in reality. What does this place look like? Do you see any guards? Do you see any cameras? And that forced players into an endless pattern of low-level planning and improvisation. After all, what was the point of planning for the next turn when that guard might just flip around and shoot you? Or maybe you'd run into a room and a camera you couldn't have seen catches you. But if we allow players to earn information beyond what they would see in reality, it would enable this kind of high-level planning. If players can peek around corners without being seen, or they can peek through doors, we're both getting a classic spy movie trope, and we're getting a way to see what you're running into ahead of time. If players can see not only what guards are doing this turn, but what guards will do on the next turn, they can plan a whole turn ahead. If players can see where cameras or guards might catch them before they can even see the guard or the camera, then every move can be part of this deeper, high-level plan that you can be confident won't fall apart in the next footstep. And we explained this saying, basically our lore was that you have a hyper-sentient AI, which is a really good thing to do if you can't say magic in your game. And this information is especially interesting because you don't always have it. It's fought for tooth and nail. If you go to investigate this one guard, that means you might be exposed to a totally different one. And this is perfect because it's just like a heist movie. In order to gain that information, you have to take these initial risks that set up the rest of the movie. And this inhuman level of information gathering allows for high-level planning, turns ahead instead of seconds ahead. The new system basically pushes our game up a couple levels, which means we kind of have a new problem, which is that the player is much stronger, and it's much hard to ever get them to lose. But now we can take our original design and move it up a few levels. We can challenge the player on a higher level instead of a lower level. You're not going to get randomly caught anymore. But now you're running out of space, you're running out of time, you're running out of resources. And it's not because of some unfair random camera that caught you. It's because the game is fighting back on the same high level at which you're playing it. Our second iteration of this stealth, which used these new concepts, was hugely successful. High-level planning was deep and interesting on its own, which allowed us to remove these double-digit damage points and health points and machine guns and all this stuff that was making our game feel like soldiers. Combat was instant and lethal. One hit meant one KO, one kill, which fit the tone of our game and also supported the stealth rather than fighting against it. Our items became more about high-level time and resources than low-level combat modifiers. So a taser can knock out any guard with no difficulty in this new prototype, but you can't use it 2 turns in a row. And that's a combat mechanic that will get you in trouble on a high-term planning level rather than a short-term execution level of damage points and you didn't roll the right number. So one problem that remained, even after this prototype with turn-based stealth, was that the guards weren't reacting on your turn. So you'd have your turn, you'd move around, they had their turn, they'd move around. But if you ran in front of a guard, they wouldn't do anything, which made it really hard to build tension and make the game feel dynamic. And we solved this problem by basically breaking the turn-based metaphor as far as we can while keeping it still intuitive for the player. So the guards do react on your turn now. It says your turn, but the guards will see you. They'll yell at you to hold up. They'll shoot you. They'll turn around to face you. But they won't move. That's the one thing we found. That's where your turn really ends, is that on your turn, the guards don't move. Cover was also revamped. So instead of shielding you from gunfire, cover now hid you completely. But this had a significant issue, which is that if we take the guard and we raycast to the agent behind cover, that's the way you'd think we do it, right? We take the guard, basically see what he's seeing. If it hits a table or a wall that you're hiding behind, he doesn't see you. The problem with that is that it creates a lot of small, unpredictable situations. So asking the player to imagine these non-tile-based, like free-form raycasts to predict whether or not a guard was going to see them seemed totally against the spirit of our tile-based, discrete, turn-based game. In addition, this prediction was incredibly important. Whether or not a guard is going to see you is basically the most important question in the entire game. So the solution we came up with is kind of a hack. It's unbelievable. Basically, an agent hiding behind cover is hidden from each and every square in front of or to the side of that cover, which means you can get into situations like this, where the guard should intuitively be able to see the agent, right? I mean, it looks like he's looking at the agent. But what we lost in this intuitive scenario, we gained back again in high-level planning, because we gave players a clear and simple system that they could abuse and use, and we ended up preferring the player over the enemy in edge cases, which meant that you could continue your high-level turns-ahead planning without fear of being caught by some random bull. So what about our procedural problems? Well, we solved these problems by using resource management and high-level planning to change the scope of the game. Now that the player is thinking about the entire level long-term rather than each short-term room, we could make a truly procedural game and actually not have to make each room interesting by its own merit, which is really good because they're not interesting taken by their own merit. They're actually really bad. And right now, they're genuinely really procedural. So in reality, we really never solved the Mark of the Ninja issue. What we did was take the player and give them high-level resources, information, planning tools, and challenges, and those challenges rippled out onto the low-level stealth. So now the low-level stealth is interesting because we solved the high-level problem. Even if you went through every room, you'd still have an interesting game. Whereas if we did Mark of the Ninja style, where you go through a room, you shut it behind you, and that room's gone forever in the game, it wouldn't be interesting. So after our second prototype, we still had a lot of issues to work out. A lot of these issues came from not pivoting hard enough and not trusting our pivot enough to new media like movies, once it had clear that pivot had worked. And therefore, we had a lot of lingering design issues and design visions from old iterations. But confidence-wise, this was really our turning point. The game was far from over, and even today, it isn't still quite finished. But we're feature complete. Before that prototype, we weren't even sure if single-player turn-based procedural stealth was anything but a really long list of adjectives we couldn't make sense of. And after that prototype, we knew the game was going to work. It was going to work fundamentally, and that it was something different. So if there's one takeaway that will really change my intuitive process genuinely in the future, what is it? I think for me, maybe, it's learning that one of the hardest things in game design is knowing when to throw an idea away, when to pivot, and when to stick with it till the end. And this was our story of our solution of making a turn-based procedural stealth game. And these were the problems that, after we solved them, we knew we could stick with it till the end. Thank you. I think we got like 3 or 4 minutes for questions, so if you are interested, then line up at a mic, and I think that's how it goes. That's also, no questions is fine too.
Hi, so in your procedural level generation, do you do any interesting kind of planning of resources for cameras and guard locations and that sort of thing along the way?
Yeah, we do. So basically, it all stems from that original thing. Originally we were thinking we'd have to make each room really interesting, right? But like I said, we extended out to high level, and so we started doing procedural on a high level. So we started, making safes and cameras. Rewards were at dead ends. Cameras were in places where it would be interesting to get caught, kind of. We started placing guards and patrol paths. We separated them out over the course of the level. And we were able to make these kind of really interesting big levels that didn't necessarily have interesting micro rooms in them. So yeah, we ended up basically pushing the procedural, the kind of factors we use in the procedural development to a higher level as well. Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
Your first go at it, your first prototype, still sounds kind of fun to me. And I don't know if I was in your situation, if I would have the presence of mind to make that pivot and to make that turn into something else. What was it? Can you go into a little more detail?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think for us it really was just that we felt like we would be making 2 games. Like it really did feel like, okay, we've got the shooty bit and we've got the sneaky bit, and we're really going to have to just make them both and make them both fun. And I think that, we just felt like we'd rather double up on a single concept. And if it sucked, then it sucked. And if it was great, then it would just be so much better than that split game kind of thing. I think we'd also seen it a lot in a lot of AAA games. You have kind of the stealth tree and the shooting tree, and you go up one or the other, and that's how you play the game. And I think we were just a little bit tired of that. We didn't want to, keep doing that and keep reinforcing that. Thank you.
So when you have procedural generation and you could make hundreds and hundreds of rooms, how do you decide how long the right level is?
For us, it was very much a process of just playing the game. We basically had just these gigantic levels. It made it almost impossible to do anything. Eventually, we have objectives in the game at the very end of the game, and that sort of determines the level size, because the objectives, we put them as far away from each other as they can be, and we basically test how long it takes to get to one objective, and then the second objective, and then the exit. And if the level's too big, that takes a really, really long time. So that was one of our major constraints. Originally, we had these gigantic final levels, and then we cut them down, and then we kind of built the rest of the game backwards. Not originally, but we pared down the rest of the procedural from there to make sure all the levels made sense in comparison to the big final levels, basically.
Did you find a sweet spot for time?
You mean like playtime?
Yes.
We found a spot for playtime. It's actually going to be really interesting. So our game's coming out soon. I'm not going to plug it, but I don't know what I just did then. Basically, a playtime in our game is like between 3 hours and 6 hours, which is really weird because it's this weird middle zone. I don't think a lot of games are in between basically FTL and Darkest Dungeon on this hand, and like Darkest Dungeon and XCOM on this hand, and FTL and Spelunky on this hand. So we're like right in the middle. I've never seen it work, so we'll see if it works for our game. I won't call it a sweet spot yet. One more question, sorry.
Okay, just to, with procedural generation, do you try and make sure it's solvable?
Yeah, we do. So we have maze generation, basically. We generate a big blocked out maze of the level, then we start plowing doors through it. We put a bunch of doors, and then we can see which doors we can lock with still having a good path through the level. So I think we use some graph theoretical concepts to make sure we have a reasonable node path through the level, and then we lock doors where we can, and we leave doors open where we can't.
But I mean, besides the physical path, what about the playability and the skill set and all of that stuff? Is it all factored in?
Yeah, the way our stealth works with being able to take cover behind objects, we actually sort of got bailed out from that one, because you can usually have a situation that isn't super insane, and even if it is, you can usually have some way to get out of it. So we try not to make them too hard just by not clustering guards, and that ended up basically solving any unsolvable situation that we might have. So we sort of lucked out in that one, to be honest.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.